mean, we do, Kalyan, I knew you'd have a question, but we do only have a few minutes before lunch, but obviously we want to kind of open this up as much as possible. So we're happy to go on as long as you are. Happy to not go and have your lunch. So Kalyan.
Yeah. Quick question, I think. In your experience over the last few years, are you seeing a difference in approach to dealing with potential corrupt situations in India? You see a difference in approach from companies that don't think the UK Bribery Act applies to them. I mean, say French or Italian or other foreign companies.
Well, from our perspective, not particularly. I mean, I would say there is a general awareness if you are a French or an Italian company and you have an operation that exposes you essentially to extraterritorial legislation like the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. I think over the last 10 years or so, there's been an exponential shift in the way that those organisations have viewed these challenges and dealt with those challenges internally by putting in the right policies and procedures, and most importantly, training programs. It's no good having world-class policies and procedures in place at HQ if you don't actually enforce them locally on the ground. And likewise, they need to be aligned to the local realities of that particular country. So, doing business in India is very different to doing business in Russia, which is where I was based for 5 years before here. There are some similarities, but there are nuances that need to be taken account of in those risk management controls. But kind of to address your question a little bit more directly, I mean, frankly, in terms of the reactive investigations work that we do as a firm, where a company suddenly finds itself subject to scrutiny, particularly on the part of the Department of Justice for potentially fraudulent or corrupt practices in its business, we are seeing as many situations like that today as we were 4 or 5 years ago, whether or not there are adequate procedures in place. A lot of the work that we do in India is actually problem solving, and particularly over the last, particularly in the run up to the last election, when the investment support pipeline started to fall away slightly as investors took a let's wait and see approach. That kind of problem solving workload increased quite significantly. So yeah, it's rather a roundabout answer, but I don't see any kind of massive difference in the way that say a UK company treats these issues in India compared to say a French or German. But clearly there could be an argument that this provides a commercial disincentive for those American companies, as many American companies have argued in Africa when competing for contracts with Chinese companies, that actually creates an unfair asymmetry that is against their interests. But it's an interesting question that will probably pan out more in years to come.
I'm Janardhan. I'm the founder secretary of the British Business Group in Bangalore. I've also been a professor teaching ethics in management schools, the most difficult subject to teach. Right? And my experience I'd like to share. When I went to register the BBG, which is a non-profit and non-governmental organization, we took 6 months. The papers went back and forth with people who were advocates in our committee, who were educated in India as well as in Britain. And then after 4 months, they asked, what's happening? They said the papers are going back and forth. And the guys in this department were asking, they are British in this group. And then they said, it has to be a company, it can't be a non-profit organization. And finally, what stopped the whole process was, somebody down there said, I want 40 to 60,000 rupees to register this BBG. That was the most ridiculous thing that happened. And how do I get about registering BBG? If this is the case for BBG, what happens to the companies that are coming into India, which are for business and not a non-profit organization? And I had to go to the extent of reaching out to the Chief Secretary of the state and get things done. But there was somebody who was demanding that kind of money. How many of you can get to the Chief Secretary? Question 1. Question 2, I reveal as a candidate for MP elections in this country. I have contested for the Member of Parliament. So I can have the hold on the government, tell these fellows do it, otherwise you'll get exposed. How many of us will be able to do this? So what I'm expecting from this session is, could there be some kind of a guideline that there is a committee formed, which would take it to the government so that you can apply these things and make things easier. We are discussing, but I want to see what is the effect in application. Because my members who are coming in would ask me, I have a few people coming from UK to set up business in Bangalore. How are you going to get the registration done? How are you going to clear it up for us? I think that's the question I have. How are we going to go ahead and see that this is in practice? Otherwise, we'll only end up discussing. I'm sorry. And we should also take it to management schools and see to it that the younger generation is groomed to be more ethical. That's it. Your answers, please.
Well, that's a nice, easy one to answer. I mean, I think just from my experience, where I've kind of worked in other markets, where I've seen companies in particular sectors, but also across sectors, dealing with those kinds of issues, most effectively is where they've actually come together as an association, where they've created integrity packs, where they've worked together to leverage their combined muscle to effectively lobby the powers that be at an appropriate level to ensure that their issues are heard. But it's not an easy thing to achieve. It is important to have a phone a friend. You obviously have a good phone a friend in Chennai, but we do say that for every company operating in India, whatever your size, you should be mapping out your stakeholders. You should be trying to understand whether you're an SME or a large, huge organization with muscles to flex. You should be mapping out your stakeholders, both those individuals and entities that could help advocate for you in that kind of situation, but likewise those individuals and stakeholders that could act against you. And to update that mapping exercise to ensure that in your sector and in your state, you're aware of the kinds of channels available in that kind of situation with which you could actually resort to. Probably your answer is a bit more complex than we can probably answer, unless.
Can I have a shot at the question?
Do you want the?
No. I mean, frankly, that's what we experience every day. Every day in business in India, we come across things like that. Just registering the company's the easiest thing. But there's always a way through without pain. It takes time, it takes persistence, and it takes practice, and it takes. You can always see the secretary, even if you plonk yourself outside his room for 4 hours, you will get to see him. And eventually that guy will be moved out of the way and will be looked, in my experience. You don't have to pay. My question is, when do you have to self-report at a UK VA? So you find something, your systems work, you find something, you have an obligation to self-report. When do you have to do that? Because frankly, all of us find things all the time, right? So when do we have to go to the SFO?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and I think it's left. There isn't any bright line rule in terms of when you have to self-report. It's not a numerical either. It's more a qualitative assessment with your own board, with your legal counsel, in terms of the frequency and the type of pattern you're seeing, and the kind of payment. It's almost the newspaper test, right? That if tomorrow someone else leaks this information and it's in the media,
So you're saying it's not substantial.
if it's not substantial, one-off, and you've taken enough remedial measures, right, that the same practice will not reoccur. So either the person's been terminated, you've put in new controls, you have a new vendor, fairly sure that the same practice will not reoccur, then even if it does come out in the paper, you can say, well, this is 8 months ago, and it's kind of very small. Whereas if it's a fairly large, substantial payment or a practice, where you've paid to get a contract versus just to clear customs, it's a different assessment. So it's more a qualitative assessment rather than is it £5 or 500 million pounds. Although the numbers will drive that decision, it's not always the numbers.
Just to add to the answer what Vidya gave, the same can also be considered under Companies Act, because you do have internal control where all the definition which has been defined in the Act, which includes policy and procedures to conduct the business, to provide the right information to the reader, preparation of the right account, assessment of the fraud, and assessment of the errors. Now they have not given any materiality level under the Companies Act. So if something like this happens, where we don't have a policy or we don't have a procedure in place, first of all, we are violating one of the act, because as a director, you have to give a responsibility statement at every year end saying that I'm functioning on a right way. So if you have any part of the year, if we got some kind of a error or some kind of a fraud, which is not as per the policy and procedures of the company, it tantamounts that have violated at least a Companies Act internal control procedure. Then audit committee, the directors, including auditors, all are under the liable to a question that why we didn't assume this process at the beginning itself, or what was the lag we had in the system, that because of this, because of the reason we got this output. So in fact that can be considered under the Companies Act violation of the internal control law.